rain came through the ceiling of my wife's sewing room at 4 in the morning, and I knew, before I found the light switch, that the money was gone. Not stolen out of a drawer. Gone the way a tide goes out, while you're sleeping and trusting the world to hold still. $14,000 handed over 3 weeks earlier to a man with a warm handshake and a truck he'd built half of himself, and now there was a hole in my roof the size of a card table, a tarp flapping loose against the dark, and water running down the wall in a thin, steady line onto the quilt my Nell never got to finish. I stood there in my socks and let it soak my feet. 72 years old, robbed in my own house, and the man who did it had a 3-day head start and a phone number that now rang once and died. What he didn't know, wherever he was counting my money that night, was that I had spent 40 years as a land surveyor. 40 years of walking into a field with a tripod and a stubborn patience, reading the ground until it gave up the truth. 40 years of finding the exact corner of a thing that did not want to be found. He thought a torn roof and a dead phone were the end of it. 3 weeks later, a single photograph would prove him wrong, one he didn't take, didn't post, and never knew existed. But to understand the photograph, you have to understand the roof. And to understand the roof, you have to understand Nell. My wife and I bought that house the year our daughter was born. It wasn't much, but Nell saw something in it the day we walked through, and 41 years later I still saw the same thing, because she'd put herself into every room of it. She took the small room at the top of the stairs and made it hers a sewing table under the window, a cedar chest at the foot of a daybed, and on the windowsill a little brass loop that had been her mother's. She'd hold it to the eye of a needle and thread that needle on the first try every time, when my hands couldn't have done it on the 10th. When Nell passed 4 winters ago, I left that room exactly as it was. Her half-finished quilt was still folded over the chair, a wedding ring pattern, blues and creams. Hundreds of hours of her hands in it. She'd been making it for our granddaughter Mia for the girl's 18th birthday, still 2 years off. Nell didn't get to finish it, and I couldn't put it away, so it sat there, waiting, the way some things wait. So when the roof over that room started letting in light where there shouldn't be light, it was never really about the roof. There are rooms a man keeps dry no matter what it costs him. That room was mine. And the money mattered. The $14,000 was most of what was left after I sold Nell's car. She'd kept it spotless, and I couldn't stand to see it in the driveway, so I let it go and put the money in a drawer for the house. So understand, he didn't take my savings. He took the last thing her hands had touched, turned into paper, meant to keep her room dry. I'm no fool. I read fine print for a living. He got me anyway, and if he could get me, he can get anyone you love. Here's how. He came to the door on a Tuesday in the fall. I hadn't called anybody. He said he'd been finishing a job 2 streets over and noticed my flashing lifting, and hated to see a roof go bad on a man who kept his house so nice. He had a clipboard, a folder of before and after photos, and a way of looking you in the eye that made you feel like the only honest person he'd met all week. Del Rourke. Rourke & Sons Roofing, painted neat in green on the door of his truck. I'll tell you the truth about Del, because if I make him a cartoon, you won't recognize him at your own door. He was good company. He knew Nell's roses by name, and when I mentioned my wife had passed, he stopped and took his cap off, actually took it off, and stood quiet a second, like her name deserved a moment of silence. You can't fake that, I thought at the time. I know better now. And he was proud of his work, that part I still believe was real, which is its own kind of terrible. He showed me the ladder rack on his truck bed and said he'd welded it himself, every joint, because store-bought ones rattled and a man should trust his own equipment. He ran his thumb along one of the welds like you'd touch something you loved. I liked him for it, and the kind of man who can be liked is the only kind who can rob you slow. He didn't ask for a thing that first day. No contract, no price. He told me to get 2 or 3 other estimates and not just take his. A scammer who tells you to shop around, I'd never heard of such a thing. It disarmed me completely. which was the entire point. Then, the next week, he sealed it. My gutter had hung loose at the corner for a year, and I came home to find Dell on a short ladder screwing it tight. Said he was in the neighborhood, couldn't drive past it, wouldn't take a dime. Pay me by letting me bid the roof honest, he said, and we both laughed, and that was the moment he had me. Not the handshake. The free gutter. A man who fixes your gutter for nothing is a man you trust with your roof. That's not kindness. That's bait. I know it now the way you know a thing only after it's cost you. I got the other estimates, like he told me to. His came in lower with a shorter timeline, and his 3 references all answered and sang his praises. Only later did I learn those 3 references were 2 people using different names, both tangled up in his operation. Even the voices vouching for him were part of the costume. He'd thought of everything except a photograph 300 miles away that hadn't been taken yet. So I signed. He asked for a deposit to lock in the price before his supplier raised it on shingles, a true thing threaded through a lie, the way the best lies are. $14,000. I wrote the check. And while I wrote it, he looked past me up the stairs and said he could see a quilt on a chair, that his grandmother used to make the wedding ring kind. Wasn't that something? He'd already cased the inside of my grief and folded it into his pitch, and I handed him the pen. My daughter Carol called that night, and I told her, proud as anything, that I'd found a roofer to fix Mama's room. And Carol went quiet and said, $14,000 up front, Dad? That's a lot before he's done anything. I told her she worried too much, that I'd checked his references and looked the man in the eye. That's the cruelest part. My own daughter saw it in one sentence over the phone, and I, who checked corners for a living, defended the man robbing me. He'd made me his lawyer. That's how good he was. Then the work started, and that's how I know the cruelty was on purpose. A crew of 2 tore the old shingles clean off the sewing room side, down to the bare deck, stretched a blue tarp over the opening, and left. Demolition first. A torn-off roof looks like progress, and progress buys a thief your patience, because once a man has opened up your house, you can't call anyone else you're committed. Exposed, the way you wait on a surgeon to finish what he's cut open. He came back once more, not to work, but to ask for more. The deck was worse than he'd thought. He'd need another $2,200 for materials. Burn this into memory. An honest roofer ties the money to the work he's already done. A thief asks for the next payment before he's earned the last. I said I'd pay the rest when the roof was on. He smiled and said, of course, and that was the last time I saw Del Rourke on my porch. After that came the excuses, smaller and meaner as they went. Materials delayed. Supplier problem. Crew chief quit. And then the one I'll never forgive, his mother needed surgery. He texted, could I be patient? I seemed like such a patient man. He'd watched me grieve my wife and reached for a sick mother to buy a week. I was patient. That was what he'd read in me the first day, the way I could read whether ground would hold water. Patience was the corner stake he'd built the whole con around. The first storm came 9 days after they tore the roof off. The tarp held. I lay awake listening to it snap and told myself he'd be here Monday. The second storm, 4 nights later, the wind got under that tarp and peeled it back like the lid off a can. The water found the bare wood, and the bare wood found the ceiling, and the ceiling found Nell's room. I went up with every pot and bowl from the kitchen and set them around that room in the dark, listening to the different notes the drops made in each one. But by morning a brown ring was spreading across Nell's wedding ring quilt slow, soaking outward through 2 years of her stitches. I sat on the floor and pressed a towel against it the way you'd press a towel to a wound, and of course it did no good. Some things, once the water's in them, you can't undo. I knelt there a long time. I'm not ashamed to tell you I talked to her. That was the morning I called his number and heard it ring once and go dead. I drove to the address on his card, 40 minutes out, and it wasn't a shop or a yard. It was a mailbox, one of 100 rented boxes in the back of a shipping store, and the clerk told me kindly that it had been closed out the week before. Rourke and Sons had no sons, no shop, no license anyone at the county could find. The whole business was a costume, and the man had taken it off and walked away wearing his own face, which I didn't even know. I filed a police report. The officer was decent, but I watched his face do the small, apologetic thing faces do before they tell you it's a civil matter. "He took your money on paper," he said. Hard to prove a man never meant to do the work when he tore the roof off and bought a tarp looks like a job gone bad, not a theft. And without a real name behind the name, there was nowhere to point a warrant. He gave me a number for the state contractor board and wished me luck. I learned later I wasn't rare. In just one recent year, Americans filed more than 80,000 reports of home improvement scams to the Federal Trade Commission, more than 80,000 people standing in their socks in the rain, holding a useless receipt. It's one of the most common ways there is to rob an older person blind, and it works because it doesn't feel like a robbery. It feels like a job that went wrong. That's the genius of it, and here is where most of these stories end. Most men my age swallow it. The shame sits heavier than the loss, the private certainty that you were the easy one, the polite old fool picked out of a lineup of porches. Carol came over, saw the room, and didn't say I told you so, which was worse than if she had. "Dad, it's money," she said gently. "Let it go." She meant it with love, and for about a week I tried. But somewhere in that week, sitting in Nell's ruined room, I understood the thing that turned the whole story. He hadn't picked our roof. A roof is a roof. He had picked me, read me the way I'd read ground my whole life. The widower, the kept-up house, the patience, the check he could already see me writing without a scene, the warmth, the cap, the welded rack, the grandmother who quilted, none of it was him. All of it was the tool. He hadn't met me at all. He'd surveyed me. And letting it go wouldn't be peace. It would just be agreeing with his read of me. So I didn't get angry. People expect a story like this to turn into an old man with a tire iron and a bad idea. It didn't. What I did was quieter, and worse for him. I went up to Nell's room, sat with the ruined quilt, and picked up her little brass loop off the windowsill, the thing she used to see the small details nobody else could. And somewhere in there, instead of angry, I got patient again. The working kind, this time. Because here is the one thing a man like Dell never counts on. He counts on the money, on your shame, on the police saying civil matter and your daughter saying, let it go. What he never counts on is that men like him cannot stop being themselves. And the very thing that makes them good at the con is the thing that, given enough patience, hands them to you. It was Mia who found him, though she'll never know it was her, and I'll never tell her. My granddaughter is 17 and lives on her phone, and one evening she was scrolling at my kitchen table while I made supper, and she went still, turned the phone around, and said, "Grandpa, isn't that the roof guy's truck?" My heart did something it hadn't done in weeks. I almost told her no, because it didn't make sense. A photo from 300 miles away. A different name on the door, Summit Crest Exteriors, not Rourke and Sons, posted not by Dell, but by a woman. A happy picture, an anniversary dinner, candles. A woman smiling with a man's arm around her shoulders. And behind them, out the restaurant window, in the lot under a light, a white work truck parked a little crooked. I took Nell's loop out of my shirt pocket I'd taken to carrying it, I couldn't say why, and held it up to Mia's screen the way Nell used to hold it to a needle, and I looked at that truck a long, long time. The name was wrong. But the truck was right. Bolted to the bed of it, catching the parking lot light, was a ladder rack with a crooked weld at the front corner that no factory ever made. The rack he'd welded himself. The rack he'd run his thumb along on my driveway like he loved it. The one part of Del Rourke that had been true was the one part that gave him up. The thing he was proudest of was the thing that found him. A younger man might have driven 300 miles that night to do something he'd regret. I didn't. 40 years of surveying teaches one lesson above the rest. The ground tells you everything if you don't rush it, and nothing if you do. So I treated Del Rourke like the hardest survey of my life, and started where you always start, with what's already in front of you. That photograph had more in it than a truck. Past the restaurant sign rose the top of a water tower, and the long shadows said early evening, the light coming from the west. A surveyor doesn't guess a position, he fixes it from what he can already see. Water towers have silhouettes the way faces do, and I matched that one against the maps the way I used to reduce a point from two known marks until it could only be one town and only the east side, where the sun would throw a shadow like that at that hour. I had him inside a square mile before I picked up the phone. Then I did the thing surveyors do that thieves always forget exists. I stopped chasing the man and went and read the public record. A man can repaint his truck overnight, but he cannot so easily change the paper underneath the business, not if he wants it to look real enough to keep robbing people. Summit Crest Exteriors had filed for a license in that county, and a license carries a name at the bottom, the same man who had once been Rourke and Sons. New paint, same man. And then the record gave me something I wasn't ready for. Rourke wasn't the first costume. Going back through the filings, one county office at a time, I found the bones of two more companies under that same name in two more towns, each a few years apart. Each had bloomed, taken in money, left a trail of complaints, and quietly died, and the man had moved on to the next name. He wasn't a roofer who'd had one bad year. He was a serial town to town, name to name, for the better part of a decade, with a string of people behind him exactly like me, each believing they were the only fool on their street. That was the moment it stopped being about my $14,000. That was the moment I understood that if I did this right, not loud, not angry, but right, I wasn't just drying out Nell's room. I was switching off a machine. So I started finding the others, because one victim is a sad story the police call civil, but a dozen across 3 counties is a pattern, and a pattern makes the law lean forward in its chair. I went through the complaints under all his old names and made calls, and they answered, the way lonely robbed people answer, grateful anyone believed them. A woman named Lorraine, $9,000 for a back porch that was now bare framing and weather. A retired Marine named Earl, $86,000 after a hailstorm for one day of demolition and a tarp the same play, down to the tarp. One by one I wrote them down. I'd spent my career mapping ground, now I was mapping a man, and the shape of him told me something only 40 years of reading land will teach you. A predator moves like water, he follows the low ground, the same way every time. Dell didn't pick his towns at random, he picked the ones a storm had just come through, where the hail was fresh and the roofs suddenly needed help, and inside them he worked the oldest streets. The small, kept-up houses where the people were my age and alone. So I pulled the recent storm tracks across his new county the way I'd pull a watershed, laid them over the pockets of older homes, and where the two overlapped I could see plain as water finding a ditch the 3 or 4 streets Del Rourke would knock on next. I didn't just know where he'd been. I knew where he was going. I'll tell you the thing I'm proudest of, and it's the thing I didn't do. I had all of it now. His town, his company, the very streets. And one Saturday I drove the 300 miles and parked across from a diner where his crew took their lunch. After a while, he came out Del Rourke in the flesh, clean shart, laughing, swinging his keys, walking toward that same truck with the welded rack like a man without a thing on his conscience. 3 months earlier he'd taken his cap off for my dead wife. Now he was laughing in the sun on her money. I had my hand on the door handle. And I knew that if I crossed that street and said one word, I'd warn him he'd vanish, put on a new name, and every page I'd gathered would be worth nothing. So I took my hand off the handle, watched him drive away, and drove 300 miles home. It was the smartest thing I did in the whole affair. Some justice you have to be patient enough to refuse the cheap version of. What I did instead was build a folder. I'm a surveyor. A folder is a thing I know how to build. My contract. My canceled check. His texts, the sick mother and all. The dead mailbox. The photograph, printed large. The maps with the water tower fixed and the storm tracks laid over the old streets. The filings tying Summit Crest to Rourke to the two names before. The statements of Lorraine and Earl. The brother-in-law on every set of articles, a man named Lyle, who filed the paperwork and never lifted a shingle in his life. Lyle built the costumes. Dell wore them. By the time I was done, it was near 200 pages, indexed with a cover sheet a busy person could read in a minute. It wasn't a sad old man with a grievance anymore. It was a map of a crime you could stand a ladder against. I took it to two places the same week: the State Contractor Licensing Board and the prosecutor's office in the county where he was working now. And even then it almost stalled. The first person at the prosecutor's office was ready to file it under civil and send me home. But a young investigator there, a woman named Reyes, sharp, no nonsense, opened the folder and turned the pages, went quiet about 10 pages in, went back to the front, and picked up her phone. Because a pattern across 3 counties under 4 names aimed at the elderly is not a disappointed customer. It's organized, repeated theft, and that changes a prosecutor's whole posture. But it was the last page that made her sit up the map, the storm tracks over the old streets. "You're telling me," she said, "you know the streets he hasn't hit yet." I told her I'd been reading Where Water Goes for 40 years, and a man like Dell runs downhill same as anything else. That map turned my folder from a history into a trap. Because, while the board reviewed my pages, Del Rourke could not stop being Del Rourke. He was still knocking on doors, still telling somebody's grandmother he'd noticed her flashing was lifting. The compulsion that had built him a decade of victims now held him perfectly still for the people coming to get him. They didn't have to chase a ghost. They knew his truck, his pitch, the welded rack, and now they knew the corner he'd turn next. So they waited on one of the streets I'd marked and let him do the one thing he could not help doing. They watched him pull into a driveway to take another deposit cash. Up front, the same truck, the crooked weld catching the light, and that deposit was the last one Del Rourke ever took. The habit that fed him is the habit that walked him into the open, onto the exact square of ground I'd told them he would. It did not all happen in one night. I won't pretend it did. Real justice is slower and grayer than the kind in stories, and it came in pieces over the better part of a year. But it came. The licensing board pulled his right to hold a license under any name in that state, permanently, so the costume that made him look real to the next grandmother was gone for good. The prosecutor charged him, not for one roof, for the pattern. Theft by deception, repeated, against a string of victims, mostly over 70, the kind of charge that doesn't bargain down to a slap. The court ordered restitution to every name in my folder mine, Lorraine's, Earl's, all of them. A long, imperfect process, but it is the law looking a thief in the eye and saying, "You will give it back." And the truck, the one with the rack he'd welded with his own 2 hands and bragged about on my driveway, was seized and sold, and the money went into the restitution fund and back out to the people he'd robbed. The single thing Del Rourke was proudest of paid the first installment of what he owed us. There's a justice in that no judge wrote down, and the others answered too, each in his own room. Because a thing done by more than one man ought to be undone, one man at a time. Lyle, who never touched a shingle but built the paper ghosts, answered for the paper barred from registering so much as a lemonade stand in that state again. The man who'd lent his voice as a fake reference had his own small reckoning. They'd hidden behind each other for years. The law made them stand alone. There's one person I never went after, and it's the part that keeps this from being a story about hate. The woman in the photograph, whose ordinary candlelit moment of love had carried that truck into the corner of a frame and undone a decade of careful evil without her knowing. She left him once the truth came out, fast, the way you back from a stove you've realized is hot. I never thought to blame her. She'd been fooled by the same warm handshake I had. She just happened to be holding the phone the night his pride caught the light. I hope she's somewhere dry now. I mean that. It's been a little over a year. Lorraine got her porch, a real one. Earl, the old Marine, got his roof and called me when it was done, and we talked an hour about nothing, the way two men do when what they mean is, "Thank you for believing me." And I got my roof. Not from him, his money's still trickling back in court-ordered pieces, and it'll be years, and I've made my peace with that. I got it from a young fellow 2 towns over, barely 30, who did the work first, and took the money after, the honest way, and wouldn't take an extra dime for the water-damaged decking once he understood which room he was keeping dry. There are far more of him in the world than there are of Del Rourke. I have to remind myself some mornings, but it's true. I had Nell's quilt taken to a woman who restores old fabric, and she worked at that brown ring for weeks, and most of it lifted out. There's a faint shadow left in the cream near the border that you'd only find if you knew to look. I've decided to leave it. Some marks you keep, the way you keep a scar, because they're proof you didn't lose the thing you fought for it and kept it. I finished the last few rows myself, badly, with Nell's loop held to the needle the way she used to, my clumsy stitches beside her perfect ones. And I laid it on the bed in that dry, quiet room where it'll wait for Mia's 18th birthday, the way it was always meant to. Nell's loop is back on the windowsill where it belongs. Carol came by the day the new roof was finished. She stood in the doorway of Nell's room a long while, looking at the dry ceiling, and then said something I didn't expect. When I'd first told her I was going after him, she hadn't been afraid I'd waste my money. She'd been afraid I'd drive up there and do something that ended with her visiting her father in a place with bars on the windows. "I told you to let it go," she said, "because I didn't think there was a version where you won and still came home." And the patience, the slow, stubborn surveyor's patience that drove her half crazy as a girl, was the very thing that gave her her father back at the end, instead of taking him away. We stood in that doorway and didn't say anything else for a while. We didn't need to. A man can take your money in an afternoon. He can do it with a handshake and a cap held over his heart, and you'll thank him while he does it. But what he cannot take, if you simply refuse to hand it to him, is your patience. And patience, it turns out, not anger, not a tire iron, not a confrontation across a diner parking lot. Patience is the one tool in the whole box that finds a man who runs. So let me ask you, the way you ask a friend. If you'd been the one standing in your socks in the rain that morning, holding a useless receipt with your own daughter telling you to let it go, what would you have done? Would you have had the patience? Tell me down in the comments and tell me how old you are watching this, because I have a feeling the answer changes with the years, and I'd like to know if I'm right. I thought that was the end of it. I thought I'd switched off one bad machine and earned myself a quiet roof. Then, a week after the last hearing, my telephone rang. A woman named Della. She'd seen my name in the local paper, and her voice was shaking the way a voice shakes when it's held something too long. She said her brother had walked their mother through signing the family house over to him in the hospital in her last days, guiding the pen in a hand that could barely hold it. And the deed was already recorded at the courthouse, in his name, the ink long dry. The lawyers had told her it was probably too late, that a recorded deed is a hard thing to undo, and she should make her peace with it. And then she asked me the question that started this whole thing over again. She asked, very quietly, if I happened to know anybody who could read a deed. I told her I'd spent 40 years reading them. And I reached for Nell's loop